Good evening, and welcome to our program, Peacebuilding in Troubled Times, a dialogue on hate and extremism. My name is Josehart. I'm board chair here at Holocaust Museum Houston, and I'm honored to be joined by three important thought leaders and champions for social justice, advocacy, and peace in our community. As we were preparing for this panel, Dina reminded me of how important it is to work together to fight hate and build peace, that no one person or institution can do it alone. Her words reminded me of a quote from Margaret Mead that hangs in the Human Rights Gallery here at Holocaust Museum Houston. Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it is the only thing that ever has. Those powerful words from Margaret Mead are the perfect introduction to our program this evening. They represent our hope that our organizations, through our partnerships, can become that force that helps change our world into one that is more humane, civil, and pursues social justice. It is now my great pleasure to introduce you to our panelists. Marjorie Joseph currently serves as the Executive Director for Houston Coalition Against Hate. The coalition is a network of community-based organizations, institutions, and leaders who come together to reduce hate and encourage belonging. The coalition is committed to addressing all incidents of hate, bias, violence, and discrimination on the basis of a person's group's religion, race, ethnicity, gender identity, expression, abilities, age, sexual orientation, national origin, creed, immigration status, or genetic information. The coalition does this through education, research, relationship building, and prevention initiatives, as well as partnering with organizations to host events that celebrate diversity and make Houston strong. Rabbi David Lyon was ordained in 1990 at Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion in Cincinnati, and has served as senior rabbi of Congregation Beth Israel in Houston since 2004. Rabbi Lyon is a vice president of the Central Conference of American Rabbis. In Houston, Rabbi Lyon is a board member of the United Way of Greater Houston, board member of Interfaith Ministries, a member of ADL's Coalition for Mutual Respect, and a member of the advisory board here at Holocaust Museum Houston. He is honored to be on one of Houston's three amigos with Reverend Bill Lawson and Archbishop Joseph Fiorenza. Dina Marks is the Senior Associate Director of the Anti-Defamation League Southwest Regional Office. Her main responsibility at ADL is publicity, but she also serves as a liaison with law enforcement, facilities, various training sessions, coordinates regional fact-finding, handles some discrimination complaints, and staffs ADL's International Affairs Committee and Committee on Law Enforcement, Extremism, and Anti-Semitism. Before joining ADL in April of 1999, she spent 21 years in television news. I want to express my deep gratitude to each of our panelists for taking the time to be with us today to share their knowledge and insights with us. To start off, I'm going to ask each of you to tell us about the mission of your organization and what peace building means to you personally. Marjorie, maybe you could start us off if you don't mind.
Sure. So you actually touched on our mission in the introduction. And, we are a collaborative of community-based organizations that come together to reduce hate and to encourage belonging. Peace building, to me, is key to the work that we do, because part of the work that we do is to cultivate allies and to cultivate justice seekers. I see peace, if I had to define it, as balance, and balance as equity. So in order for us to actually achieve a state of peace, we need to cultivate those justice seekers and those allies that will help get us there.
Thank you so much. Rabbi Lyon, maybe you could tell us in particular how you see the mission of your synagogue contributing to peace in the world.
Well, thank you for asking. So good to be with Marjorie and Dina, and thank you, Carl, for convening and leading this conversation. Peace building is really at the heart of synagogue life. Through worship, education, and community building, we try to build bridges between members of the Jewish community and well beyond it to other parts of the community too. I've often said that there's a difference between justice and peace. We might not find justice as soon as we'd like, but we can certainly seek peace between us even where there are differences. And the pluralistic nature of our community is something that we can celebrate, which I think we're aiming to do. So within the synagogue, our mission really is to use the pulpit and the classroom and times to gather on holidays and other events to appreciate what our tradition always calls on us to do. First, in Leviticus, we read the golden rule, love your neighbor as yourself, which is shared by the Christian community too. And Rabbi Hillel taught us, what is hateful to you, do not do to others. So we aim to find within ourselves who we are, what we are, and share the best of us with others and try to find it in others too.
Thank you so much. Dina, well, let's turn to you and see what you can add to this as well.
Well, you asked about our mission, and we like to say that ADL began in 1913 with $200, 2 desks, and a 2-part mission, which is to fight the defamation of the Jewish people, to fight anti-Semitism, and to secure justice for all. And to Rabbi Lyon's point, sometimes you can't always secure justice, but part of ADL's mission is to try to promote peace and respect by countering hatred, something we're going to be talking about tonight, in its many, 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 many forms. Hatred is sort of like a virus, and we've heard a lot about viruses in the last year, and because viruses kind of can kind of subside or kind of hide, and then they'll pop back up. Hate's kind of like that. So ADL's been around for over 107 years, almost 108 years. And it's because we constantly have to strive to fight hate and to promote peace.
Thank you. You know, I think we've all experienced such a disturbing rise in hate speech recently, related to race, religion, sexual orientation. It's sometimes hard to know where to begin. Like, what are the priorities? How do we get started? Thoughts from any of our panelists on how, if someone is feeling overwhelmed, how do they know where to start? What's some good rules of thumb?
I don't mind handling that tough
Okay.
question. It is a challenging question. I've always learned that we fear the things that we don't understand. And I really believe that we have a duty first, or perhaps second, to understand others, to enter into dialogue with them. And if not dialogue, then to read about them, to understand where they come from and how they've come to reach the opinion that they hold. But a very important component of this is understanding ourselves. I feel that young people, for example, who head off to college are sometimes very unprepared. Somebody will ask a college student or any of us, who are you? We can answer that question. But when they ask, what are you? And they say, I'm Jewish, or I'm Muslim, or I'm something else, you have to really know yourself. And the only way to do it is to find self-respect through deep understanding of your heritage, your roots, your culture, and be able not to defend yourself, but to know who you are and what you are so that you don't become something that you're not, or find that you're intimidated by somebody who might know themselves better than you know yourself. So I think that's part of the way to overcome the challenge, by understanding others, but not at the expense of digging deeply to understand who are we.
Yeah, I think, I agree with you. I think that for many people, it's very hard to understand sort of the systemic racism or the biases that exist or the obstacles that get created for many of the people. And so I think in addition to knowing ourselves, as you spoke so eloquently about, Rabbi Lyon, it seems like there might be also a part of understanding how society is not necessarily a level playing field for everyone. Mm-hmm. And I wonder, Dina or Marjorie, do you see the roles of your organization as helping to kind of bring those things into people's awareness? To maybe Marjorie, you're smiling. I think that looks like you might have something to say.
Yeah, so the coalition actually created a model called the Justice Over Equity model. And that kind of organically came about as we were crafting our justice statement, which we use in lieu of a DEI policy or a DEI statement. And really keeping justice over equity as the way towards equity, because as you said, it's not a level playing field, and we need to get to a point where we could break the silence around that, where we could acknowledge it, and then we can start to try to undo that. So for us, that's one step that we've taken, that we call on our members to try to adopt a justice statement of their own and to align it towards their mission, and to see how they can embody that and make that an actionable action, right? So we know, for instance, that the minimum wage should be $15 at least. That would be a living wage. And I think as gatekeepers and leaders of institutions, we really need to ask ourselves, do we really need to wait for that to become law and policy before we actually institute it ourselves? And how many other things have we failed to just simply institute ourselves?
I like that idea of, that taking initiative, not waiting, to be told that it's mandatory or that it's law, but right, sort of leading by example. One of the things that seems to be an incredible tool, but also a great danger now is the internet. It's easy to order in food or find the, answer to a question you've been searching for. But, Dina, I think your organization probably better than most knows about some of those dangers as well. How do you suggest people approach the use of social media? Is it a tool that we can use to grow peace, or is it, do you see it more as a danger?
I see social media as a double-edged sword. It can be a tool to grow peace. Certainly, it can be used for good and it can be used for bad, and it is used for both. So it's an incredible, powerful tool, but it also can be very dangerous. ADL uses social media in many ways to track extremists. We're talking about, in some cases, extremism and hate. The fact that extremists use social media helps us follow them and provide intelligence and information to law enforcement about them. But then some of the language that they use and some of the ways that what they say tends to grow hate, all of that is problematic. So we also work through our Center for Technology and Society with social media platforms to try to get them to regulate some of that language, not to go against the First Amendment and freedom of speech, but to be responsible if they have a policy, to enforce that policy. So those are some of the things that we do as far as social media are concerned. And we've had various campaigns. We're about to do a campaign in the Texas legislature called Backspace Hate, which is going to promote bills that will attack bullying and that kind of thing on social media. We've also done something with a bunch of other organizations called Stop Hate for Profit, where we looked at different platforms and encouraged them to enforce their policies. And and not because we had a couple of days where we didn't sell advertising or buy advertising, have companies buy advertising on those platforms. So we've been somewhat successful with that. But again, it's a double-edged sword. It can be used for both.
I think it's a very challenging time in our community to be finding ways to be out and about building these relationships and building peace. COVID has made so much harder. I imagine, Rabbi Lyon, with your organization, probably more than many, not being able to gather together has been a challenge. How do you continue to do your work in these strange and unusual times?
You could ask anybody, how do they continue to do their work in these strange and unprecedented times? The truth is that we persevere. It isn't just resilience. It's really accepting the circumstances as they are and not seeing it as a crisis, but it is a challenge. And we muster all the resources that we can to make a difference. Thankfully, we have technology. Imagine we're doing this on Zoom, but during the 1918 epidemic, there was no such thing, and people were truly isolated. But what we aim to do as well, look, I've been accused of being political. The truth is that Judaism, a culture, a faith, a tradition, a civilization, we advocate for those things that sustain us. Democracy sustains the Jewish people. Equity, fairness, fighting anti-Semitism sustains us, sustains all people. And when we talk about using the internet and social media, we used to say that having discriminating taste was a very good thing. I think you have to have discriminating taste when we approach social media. We're flooded with information. It doesn't mean that we're more knowledgeable. We're just flooded with information. And if we can be discriminating about what we read so that we're educated by it at the same time, then we're using social media and the internet for something productive. And by using live stream for worship services and Zoom for Torah study and for classes, even holding religious school classes, we're able to use the technology for something productive and frankly modeling how to use this technology for something helpful and useful. The truth is that because of the internet, people who tune in are not limited to Houstonians. We have people tuning in from all over the country, and they get to hear different opinions and voices from different regions they've never visited and understand more about us, whether it's somebody who doesn't understand Jews or even Texans. They begin to hear us and learn about us, and maybe that's a form of bridge building too.
Yeah. You used, I think, a very important word. You talked about resilience. Certainly here in Houston, we've needed to learn to be resilient for weather crises. But it seems like as a society, we're still susceptible. Every economic downturn or challenging time, it seems hate speech rises. And I wonder if there's a way that we can build resilience in our communities against a rise in hate speech and discrimination. What are those muscles or those skills that we need to encourage people to develop that will sort of inoculate against us, against that happening? I don't know, Dina or Marjorie, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, so I have a love-hate relationship with the word resilience because we are forced to be resilient, but I'm a dreamer. I have an ideal that one day we won't have to be that way, because when we're asking communities to be resilient, it is the mark that systems and something needs to change. After that, though, as an organization, in response to the rise in anti-Semitism and anti-Asian sentiments that we've experienced, and normally the coalition is not a direct service organization, we're a member organization that exists to help build capacity and relationships between the organizations within Houston. But because on the heels of George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and all this xenophobia that we've been experiencing. We partnered with OCA Greater Houston and an organization called Hollaback that's based in New York City, and we will be outward facing, giving bystander trainings to the community. We can have up to 2,000 participants per month on each training every third Thursday. So I encourage all of you to share with your, your folks, your databases, the folks that you serve, so that we can start to build allies, so that people have the information they need, so that if they find themselves ever in a situation, whether it's in person or online, that they have the skills, that they have the resources to know whether or not they should respond, how to respond, not to respond, how to be of assistance to victims. So that's just one of the ways that we see that we can serve in this particular area.
Carl, if I could just add a little bit to that and
Please.
jump off of something that Marjorie just said that I really love, and that is that she's a dreamer. And I think you build resilience by having that dream that one day we won't have to be doing what we're doing. The day I started working at ADL, I said, boy, I would love nothing else than to work myself out of a job. Because it is so important to have that dream that one day we can eradicate hate. And one of the big words at Holocaust Museum Houston, where I've been a docent since 1997, is hope. Hope is so important. So we've always got to have hope that we can do this. As long as we're together, we can do this. And there are various tools. Marjorie just spoke of a wonderful tool that the Houston Coalition Against Hate is providing to all of us. But there are things that we can do as individuals. We can be critical thinkers. We can look at information and not take information at face value. Try to learn, listen more, learn more before you jump to conclusions about other people or situations. There's so many things that we as individuals can do, but I think it's so important too that we work together to promote this hope and this dream that we at ADL on our 100th anniversary said, imagine a world without hate. We must imagine a world without hate. We've got to, and we've got to fight for it all the time.
I think all of you have been talking about something that I think is really important. I think, Marjorie, you used the word ally. And I think that that's something that many people are struggling with, how to be an ally, how to know when to speak up and how to speak up. You know, when it's not your own community, you sometimes worry, is my voice welcome? You know, I would like to maybe have us talk a little bit about how to become an effective ally, and because as we all been saying, the work requires all of us, but sometimes it's hard to know how to get started down that path. I don't know, Rabbi Lyon, any thoughts? I see you kind of nodding.
Yeah, sure. I think in a large part, we have in the Jewish community sought to be allies with others because we've always identified ourselves as a minority community. I can't say that we've always been invited, warmly. Sometimes we're terribly misunderstood. But I've also learned, and I think we've tried to teach, that we can't do only for somebody, we can do with somebody. So it's very important to have conversations with people and ask. I remember myself being in a situation, learning about another community, and because my children were young, I asked a few people if I had explained to my children about their community correctly. And when they gave me a thumbs up and affirmed my choice of words and my instructions to my young children at the time, it helped me feel that I had learned vocabulary, understandings and concepts that were new to me, but were very helpful. Then I could act in an appropriate way with greater confidence and understanding. And frankly, it is about being, at least as a rabbi, being a community leader, to lead the congregation, to lead the community in a direction, into a place where we are not strangers, we are friends and allies who advocate for common denominators, which lead us in the directions we all want to go. So I don't want it to make it just a dream, it should be a reality. Jews know well the expression, Im tirtzu ein zo agadav. If you will it, it is not a dream. If we advocate for ourselves and others, it certainly won't be.
Yeah, I think the point that you were making about asking and seeking education is so important. There's a wonderful sort of phrase that the disability community, I think, made popular, but I think it's so apropos to many groups. And they would say, nothing about us without us. And the idea is we're more than happy to have people join and support, but don't speak for us or over us, you know. And I think to be an authentic ally, that's perhaps part of what you need to do, is be willing to be led by the group that's being impacted about what would actually be helpful, what would be perceived as support, rather than make assumptions about that. So great lesson and great example of that. Thank you so much for sharing that. So, you know, I guess, you know, one of the things is we're start to invite our audience, hopefully, to share their questions as well, is to think about how those people who are participating tonight, you know, who are inspired by what they're hearing, you know, what are some of those ways that they can get involved and become a peace builder, an upstander, an ally in our communities?
Well, some of the ways that I can think of, like Dina was saying, we wish we could work our way out of a job, but right now the fact is that we're very much in need, and so supporting organizations like ADL, supporting institutions, religious, educational institutions that are helping to push the needle and move the needle, joining coalitions or collaboratives, learning how to be a good activist, how to advocate, holding our politicians, local and national, accountable for what we want, right? We elect them. So, and also being willing to have uncomfortable conversations. I think especially I see the coalition as helping to provide a space that can allow for courageous, uncomfortable conversations to be had, so that, I mean, if you don't feel safe, right? And it's hard to fully feel safe, but I think in building the bridges, forming the friendships, fostering co-sponsorships, and working together on things will help folks to feel more, I don't want to say comfortable, because it's really, you want to be okay with the discomfort, and you want to be willing to do the self-reflection and the self-analysis, because also I feel like love is a component here. If we have trauma that is unhealed, whether it is personal, ancestral, if we don't do that personal work and we're not loving ourselves, then how can we possibly love somebody else?
Yeah, it's a complicated mix of internal work and reaching out. And I love what you said about being courageous enough to, you know, to be uncomfortable and to learn, you know, to experience something that may be new or different. One of the people watching in our audience wanted to know, you know, from the panel, what do you think, or what do you attribute the rise in anti-Semitism and racism to? You know, do you have any thoughts about kind of the source of where that comes from?
I don't think that it's necessarily, it might be a rise in open anti-Semitism and racism. I don't think it's necessarily a rise in those two things. And the way, I think it's the way they manifest themselves. And just like I was talking about earlier, hate being a virus, which kind of hides and then comes back. having worked at ADL for almost 22 years now, I can see that hate comes in waves. And right now we're in a very high wave of hate. And in some ways, in some instances, if people get away with hateful things, then other people are emboldened. And I think there's been some of that. I think our leaders need to be held more accountable in fighting hate and in calling out hate. I think that since they haven't been held accountable enough, that has emboldened some people. And it's not just up to our leaders, it's up to everybody.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that, there's a famous quote that often is used in Holocaust education from Pastor Niemöller, who talked about, first they came for the Jews and I didn't speak up because I wasn't Jewish. And, sort of eventually when they came for me, there was no one left to speak up. And I think we have really begun to reimagine, and Marjorie, I think maybe you mentioned this, that idea of intersectionality, that we need to bring it more to the forefront, how much whatever happens to one of us, it happens to all of us. And so I think, here at the museum, you'll see in many of our exhibits sort of a new focus on that. We have an exhibit currently called Stories of Survival, and it includes artifacts not only from survivors of the Holocaust, but also from genocides around the world, including Armenia, Bosnia, Cambodia, Iraq, Rwanda, South Sudan, and Syria. And as I've been touring people through it, it doesn't lecture you about intersectionality, but you see the light bulb go off that the people living in these parts of the world may look different, they may have different traditions, but what hurt them was the same. And, if we allow it to hurt any one group, it hurts all of us. Dina, there was a question for you specifically. What do you see the future looks like within social media circles in regard to regulating hate speech? Do you think there's a possibility that we might see more activity in that space?
Yes, I think so. I think there's already been some activity in that regard, especially with the Stop Hate for Profit campaign, which did have somewhat of an effect. I think what we saw on January 6th and some of the reaction in social media to that has opened some people's eyes, but it's a changing landscape. Social media are changing all the time. And so it's going to be hard to hold social media platforms accountable. But again, just like I was talking about with fighting hate, we have to continue to work toward that. So I think it's possible we can see more, but I can't say for sure.
I think it's interesting, in other parts of the world, they handle this differently. We had some visitors here from Germany not too long ago at the museum. And after the Holocaust, they have very strict laws about hate speech. And they were sort of raising for us to consider sort of that balance between free speech and allowing hate speech. And in their perspective of this particular visitor, he felt that maybe we allowed sort of too much on the side of freedom. Those are complicated questions, but you wrestle with them all the time.
Yeah. Carl, I think you're right. And Dina, I agree about social media. One of the challenges that I observe is that the laws, the ethical boundaries connected to social media just haven't kept up with social media. It's an industry that took off and technology changes so rapidly, but how fast does Congress work? There's a great disparity between the two. And so we're really left to the whims of CEOs and other corporate heads of social media who have become powerful and wealthy and in control across the world without really ever knowing a boundary, whether it's physical or legal or ethical. And now they're being held to account, but still we need great ethicists, perhaps theologians and others to engage and talk about what does it mean to have free speech. Is yelling fire in a crowded theater the same as raising up hateful, conspiratorial conjecture on social media? And just because you say it often, making people think that it's true. So we have big questions and big responsibilities ahead of us in this area.
Yeah, it's complicated. One of the members of our audience asked how hate is most effectively confronted, and does deplatforming work? You know, there's been this, pressure on social media to clamp down, and is that an effective tool, or is it just sort of one tool in a toolbox? Any thoughts about that?
Well, to the question of deplatforming, I think it remains to be seen how effective that is. One of the things we found is that if you deplatform someone from one platform, they move to another.
Right.
So to Rabbi Lyon's point, we really need to look at social media and try to figure out ways to enforce policies, to get them to use their freedom of speech with responsibility. With freedom comes responsibility. So we need to try to get the leaders of those platforms and those companies to understand you have a responsibility here. And I think it's very tough.
Yeah. Marjorie, there's a question here for you. If you would be willing to share a personal experience where your work changed minds and eliminated hateful perspectives. So have you had a moment where you achieved a piece of your dream that you can share with us?
I will say that we have gotten a lot of feedback from our members that they have had shifts in thinking, that they have formed deep friendships and relationships with one another. But repeat the question one more time, because
was there an experience where that you saw the impact of your work sort of change attitudes?
Well, I will say, and Dina can probably speak to this moment more, is that right before we closed, because we normally meet in person, and we would have a monthly meeting. Our last meeting was held in a mosque. And our current board president had made a comment in that meeting, and she said, this is the first time that ADL is actually in the same room as CARE. And I know that there's a long history behind that relationship, but I'll say just the fact that both were willing to, and then we had some other members, we had Sisterhood of Shalom Shalom in the room, and they said, I have never been in a mosque. Wow, it feels good to be in a mosque. So I think, these are some small wins that we're seeing happen in the Houston community. Hopefully we can grow those into larger conversations and more times together, breaking bread and doing, advocacy work together. So
yeah, I want to put an exclamation point on that, Marjorie. You're absolutely right, because the Houston Coalition Against Hate has become just that, a coalition. And we've all talked about how it starts with ourselves. So if we can start with ourselves and we can bring people together who aren't normally at the table together, then there's a lot more we can do together.
Yeah. It's like solidarity embodied.
Yeah. And I think there's, reading and learning is clearly important. I do think there is something unique to breaking bread together or sharing a worship service with someone in person that is transformative in a way that perhaps reading about something can't always take you all the way there. And when you can have a shared experience, that can be very meaningful. The other thing, Marjorie, I was thinking about while you're talking is sort of the idea of planting seeds. When you talked about someone changing their attitude, I was thinking then that person with their children or nieces or nephews or whoever they influence will be teaching the next generation something healthier. And
yeah, and I think so many times we focus on how do you reach those who are on the extreme end. And for me, the only way that I know how to reach those folks really starts with the personal, looking at, introspective and what might spark them to do that. But I've been really interested in folks who are good-hearted, who are on the cusp, who have not had the proper information or the proper education, and some exposure clicks, something clicks for them in that exposure. So like I've been really interested in getting folks in the middle a little bit over more. Right? Yeah.
Start with those closest to you, right?
Yeah. And those who hesitate, who don't feel comfortable to speak up, because we've been socialized not to speak up. We've had fear instilled in us. So trying to conquer also the ways that we've been socialized, the ways that we have been educated. I think if we can successfully do that, then we're gonna find that we will have an impact.
There's a question from one of our audience saying, is it possible to compare the current wave of hate and unrest as well as the new activism that we're seeing in response to that with past waves, such as the 60s and 50s, for example? Do you see commonalities or differences that kind of strike you?
I see differences. I see good differences. I see more people who don't look like each other standing together, protesting and coming out, so that's been a positive for me. That's made me really hopeful and even more of a dreamer, because I feel like, when you compare civil rights to now, the numbers that have come out recently just far exceed. And it's so many different people coming out. So that's been nice to see.
I agree, Marjorie. And I think that maybe one of the positive spins on social media is that people who didn't think they had a voice or a place on the street corner or in other halls of the legislature actually have a place to be heard and to speak out appropriately. I think the Jewish community in particular has always been sort of prepared for these peaks in anti-Semitism and hate. Not to say that it's the same page from the old playbook, but I also believe that what's different this time is that the permission for hate or the permission for anti-Semitism has come from places that have been unfamiliar to us. Nevertheless, there have always been unusual leaders of industry or faith traditions who have spoken against Jews and Judaism and other minorities, obviously. So I think we're learning from the past. And I think if anything that the Jewish community learns is that we cannot be passive. We have to be proactive about every step of it. And as we say, never again becomes our mantra, but also we have to learn how to do it differently. I also want to insert the name Eric Ward. I know Dina knows Eric Ward. Marjorie, if you don't, I hope that you will. He's the executive director of Western State Center, and he spoke at an ADL summit in New York a year ago. He was a guest at Congregation Beth Israel most recently. He made a very stunning point. He changed my focus a little bit on this issue. He said, if all of us can come together and fight anti-Semitism, it is at the root of so much other hate and bigotry and xenophobia, because once we permit anti-Semitism, we permit all of it. And if we can come together, build bridges and coalitions, as you've done so well, Marjorie, and I'd like to know you better and do more work with you, we might be able to accomplish more if we really begin to see anti-Semitism as the age-old and the sort of the core issue that we all have to address and overcome.
There was an interesting question that came up from our audience. that an observation first and then a question, that hurt people who have been hurt others, and that people who hate often come from a place of hurt. And the sort of wanting us to sort of respond to that idea or that thought.
Yeah, so actually, we had a coalition meeting hosted at Holocaust Museum Houston, where we had two extremists, ex-extremists, share their story with what led them to their extremism. And it was really eye-opening, because what led them to their extremism, in my past experience working with gang-affiliated young people, it was past trauma. It was wanting to belong, growing up in a traumatic household and seeking belonging and not knowing where to go. And so, like Dina said, the internet, then one of the negatives is that, these extremists prey on people who are seeking to belong. So I think that to your question, that's why I said self-growth, self-healing, introspection, really looking at what can I do? Do I run an organization? Am I an employee somewhere? Can I talk to HR? Can I talk to the CEO? Can we start to change the culture here, right? But that can only start with someone having the courage to want to have that uncomfortable conversation, possibly with a superior, or that can only start when you have an ED or a CEO that's willing to share with their board the importance of shifting and transforming the organizational culture somewhere. So there are lots of things that we can do, but when you're looking at what sends someone in that direction, we had two personal stories shared with us, and the root of it was trauma.
Yeah, I've always wondered, I've marveled that in South Africa, after the fall of apartheid, there was a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And no one process can be perfect. But I thought the instinct to try to heal some of those wounds was a good instinct, because without some measure of healing, it would have seemed impossible to imagine moving forward. And I just wonder about how that could be perhaps an inspiration for some work that we still need to do here in this country. As we all imagine a world where we can get to these root causes and hopefully start to turn the tide. We have a question here about how do we reach young people at an early age to help them, grow into and become upstanders and peace builders? Any thoughts about that? I know you must wrestle with that in your education programs at the Synagogue, Rabbi.
Sure. Well, look, I've often said we can do a lot of things in the synagogue. We can teach, we can preach, we can do lots of things. But if it isn't happening at home, it isn't happening. So we can inspire in that place. But actually, technically, in the Jewish community, the most important place in the Jewish community is the Jewish home, not the synagogue. So I think we have to bear up and handle our responsibility well to have the finest education programs that aren't just fun, but are also substantive and educational, relevant, modern, all of that. But we have to send home and empower parents to continue the lesson that we've sent their children home with. The old story is that kids get in the car after religious school and the parents ask them, what did you learn? And they say nothing, and it was boring. When we know very well, we've worked all week very hard to give them something that they can take home. But when they go home and the parents tune their children out and don't ask questions that are meaningful and don't replicate the lessons through using words like mitzvah and tzedakah and resilience and allyship and all the words that kids are actually hearing on the internet and hearing in their public school settings, then we're failing really to sew up the lessons from place to place, and we need to be partners. I've often said to Jewish parents, bring your children to us. We're your partners in helping to rear your children to be the citizens of the world that you want them to be. But if you just ignore us or tune us out at 12 o'clock on a Sunday, then our work is for naught. And a good citizen and a good upstanding person doesn't happen by accident.
If I might add to what Rabbi Lyon said about it beginning in the home, I just want to say, I always call myself the luckiest girl in the world because I had parents who were such amazing, amazing role models. Parents who literally risked their lives to fight hatred in some cases. My mom brought Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. to Houston to do a benefit concert to try to help integrate schools. My father was very involved in civil rights. They were both very active in the community, and it was always with an eye toward helping others. And so here I am working at ADL for 22 years, and it's because of my parents. I want to carry on their legacy. So I think I'm a perfect example, not that I'm perfect, but I'm an example of how you teach your children that it's important to respect others and love others and work with others. My parents were great models of that. So that's one thing you can do. And then I know that our organizations, Congregation Beth Israel, Houston Coalition Against Hate, the Holocaust Museum, ADL, we have lots of materials that we can provide and resources we can provide to parents on our website and to teachers and educators for how to talk to children about these issues. On ADL's website, their curricula, I know the Holocaust Museum Houston has that sort of thing. Great resources in all our organizations. And I encourage people to look at that.
Yeah, here at the museum, we have a program called Engines of Change that targets high school students and helps them develop their voice and understand those issues that we've been talking about, so that hopefully they can put those ideas into action in their own communities, with their friends, in their schools, in their families. And so I think you're right there. We're fortunate to live in a community that is rich with resources if we're willing to engage with them. We do have
Can I add to that?
Oh, sure, please.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, ADL has no place for hate. And we had partnered with them and we had done some in-school read-alouds. And I think what sat for me, Rabbi, when you were talking about home, and Dina, like I too have been privileged in that way. And it's expressed itself like you, Dina, and what I've chosen to do for a living. But some grief came up because I know so many BIPOC do not have that due to systemic oppression and racism. The home is lacking resources of all kinds. And so for me, when you hear that, it's like, yes, that's the answer. But then I start to be like, oh my God, how much more work do we need to do to, when we look at the whole justice over equity model, to get folks to that level playing field, so that yes, then it could just be about the home. Yeah.
Well, Marjorie, it brings me back to where you started us towards the beginning of our conversation about why something like the minimum wage is a justice issue. If the home isn't safe, or because they don't have what they need and there isn't food on the table, and it's not, there's no power or whatever they need, how do you create a home that can raise children that feel safe and empowered and a part of society when they feel neglected? And so I think it all kind of ties back, to where we started. We have a young member of our audience who says he's living in a city where Proud Boys and other white nationalists have held multiple rallies. And he's struggling, or he or she, to understand, is physical confrontation and street action ethical in response to them? Is there a time for physically fighting back? I think that's a complicated issue. And clearly, Martin Luther King and, during the civil rights movement, nonviolence really only looked nonviolent on one side. The people protesting often did so at great risk of harm. So any thoughts or advice for this person?
Carl, I want Dina and Marjorie to respond. I'm no fighter. I've no scars to show. But I will tell you from a Jewish point of view, halacha or Jewish law would teach us that the only time that we should go actively to fight, to pursue, is if someone were pursuing us. A rodef, as it's called, one who pursues to take our life and to harm us, is a reason that we can defend ourselves. But any other, to lash out, to fight somebody who's just yelling, words are words, and there are other methods. And Dina and Marjorie may have certainly more to add because they've stood on the front lines too.
I agree.
I do too.
I would never encourage anyone to definitely instigate or to be the starter of violence. So we stand against all hate, bias, violence, discrimination. And I really feel like there are other ways and hopefully other tools and resources that can be used. And I would hate for this person to be, be in harm's way unnecessarily. So I would never encourage that. And I agree with you, Rabbi.
Yeah, and I agree too. I think one way that whoever's asking a question could be helpful is to, whenever they see a demonstration like that, if law enforcement officers aren't there, call law enforcement, let ADL know what's going on in the community, because ADL's Center on Extremism keeps that information and provides it to law enforcement when law enforcement officers can't keep that information. So you can fight it in different ways, like Marjorie says, but physical confrontation is almost never necessary.
Thank you. I think that the pain and anger that gets created is often a difficult emotions to manage. But I think we've found throughout history that violence is often a terrible cycle, that you can't make peace with violence. Peace only comes through peaceful actions. And but it is a very difficult position to be in. There was a question specifically for you, Dina, about what has changed since January 6th with the ADL. Are there specific actions or that you're taking as an organization to address the hate groups that were represented in this really unprecedented kind of action that took place?
I have to say, not a lot has changed. Even before January 6th, we were monitoring these groups, and people can go on our website and see a blog we put out on January 4th that warned that something like this could happen on January 6th. So we're still doing that work where we do monitor these things, and we do try to work with law enforcement and with political leaders and governmental leaders to just give them the information that we think will be helpful in this regard. We have been a little bit more focused on social media and social media platforms. And again, we've spoken out many times about how our leaders need to call out this type of hate. And one of the things we're planning to do locally within the next few months is to create a series of programs on disinformation. I think one of the big problems we have right now is that there's a lot of disinformation floating around out there. And people have gotten to the point where they can't really tell what's true and what's not true. So we're going to probably give a voice to various members of the community about how they determine what's true, what's not true, and how they, for instance, say the media, how the media will try to figure out information that comes to them, what's true, what's not true, and then provide it to the community, and how they're interpreted. Media are interpreted totally differently now than they used to be. So that's something that we're working on locally.
Yeah, and I think that speaks so much to a lot of what we've discussed, the importance of having people you trust in friendships and relationships with people in other communities. So when you see something or hear something that doesn't feel right, you have a trusted colleague or friend you can reach out and say, how do I understand what I'm hearing? You know, is there something that I can inform myself so that I can make a more reasoned, you know, interpretation? As we're getting closer to the end of our dialogue, which I'm enjoying so much, I want to make sure to offer each of you the opportunity that if there's something we haven't yet covered that, you know, you really wanted to express, or something that your organization is doing that you want to share with the community, you know, now would be a great time for you to share those thoughts with us. Yeah, Marjorie, I saw you take yourself off mute.
No, it's like, Dina could go. Okay. I'm going to look for a quote I actually wanted to share.
Okay. I just want to say, I think I'm very honored and privileged to be with this august group of people here. I've worked with all of you before and want to continue working with you in as many ways as we possibly can, because to your point, Carl, we really need to work together on this issue. And it's such a comforting thing to have allies like this. And I also want to thank everybody who joined this conversation, because the fact that you joined the conversation tells me that you're interested in this topic and that maybe you're willing to stand along with us in this ever-present desire to imagine a world without hate.
Thank you, Dina.
I'm going to make one last push for our bystander trainings. We can have up to 2,000 participants every month for the next 7 months. So that's 14,000 people that can learn how to be a bystander, whether it's online or whether it's in person. So please go to HoustonAgainstHate.org, BIT, and register for whichever month works for you. It's every third Thursday. And I wanted to share a quote from Rashad Robinson, the president of Color of Change. And he said it in a New York Times interview that he had. He said, "We don't get racial justice out of a true democracy. We get a true democracy out of racial justice." So we need to continue to push for our democracy and to push for the things that we know are important to us. And also in terms of resources, please check out the Justice Statement. Think about incorporating it, and also let's allow each other grace. I know cancel culture has come up a lot recently. And I think as we are learning and cultures and is shifting, there are going to be those moments where we make errors. And as long as you know that someone is good-hearted and good intentions, let's allow grace as we're learning, as we're improving.
Well, amen to that. And I love that you dream big. Marjorie just challenged us to train 14,000 upstanders in the next few months. And Houston, I think we're up to the challenge. So thank you for that, Rabbi Lyon.
Yeah, we can do it. You know, I've often said that it's only in a democracy that Judaism has ever thrived. And so we have to do everything we can to preserve it and sustain it. I want to lift up a verse. I was asked recently a favorite verse that I like to live by and like to teach, and I'll share what I said to somebody else. In Deuteronomy, we read, Lo tuchal lehitalem, and it means you shall not remain indifferent. Another translation is you shall not hide yourself. And we know that Elie Wiesel taught that the opposite of love is not hate, it's indifference. Because the truth is that love is fabulous, we should all love. And there are those people who hate, but it's still a feeling. And we can work on somebody who hates to transform that heart into somebody who can love. It's the indifference that is inhuman. And Wiesel struggled with too. And it may be, as Marjorie said, we can't fix everybody, we can't heal everybody, and maybe we have to go find the people who hate, because at least they're feeling something, and we can bring them around and bring them closer to those of us who know how to love people who aren't just like ourselves, and then work later on those who are truly indifferent. But we as leaders, thought leaders, need to remain engaged and make a difference where we face the encounters that challenge us every single day. But like you, Dina, I want to thank you for this marvelous opportunity. And I would be remiss if I didn't say that on behalf of all the rabbis in Houston and all the synagogues in Houston, we're all at this. We all do this work. And all of us are very committed to the very, very special topic and conversation that we've shared this evening.
Thank you, Rabbi, for those inspiring words. Here at Holocaust Museum Houston, we really feel so grateful that we have a platform and we have the resources to lift up voices in our community. We feel incredibly blessed that our museum honors the legacy and the loss of in the Holocaust, but we also recognize that there are communities that don't have that voice and don't have that platform and don't have those resources. And we invite the entire community, and we're so grateful that you're all with us tonight, because we want to use the resources that we have to lift up those voices and tell those stories so that everyone in our community feels that they have a safe place to, to tell their story and be heard and seen and recognized for who they are. And so my deepest gratitude to our panelists tonight for sharing your vision, your passion, and your real caring for our community. And it's an honor to work with you every day, and I hope that we'll continue to find ways to do that into the future. And with that, we'll thank everyone who's joined us from home, and we hope to see you in our organization soon to carry on the mission. And Marjorie, next time we talk, I want to hear how we're doing on that 14,000 number.
I'm gonna let y'all know.
All right. Well, good night, everyone. Thank you so much for coming.